Science,
engineering,
medicine,
chemistry,
physics,
biology,
humanities, cardiology,
computing,
public health, global
aeronautics, science communication.
Hello everyone, it's Gareth Mitchell again. Fun fact, this podcast has been running since 2007. So every now and again we like to dig into the archive to look back on those especially memorable interviews. We've narrowed down a few of our favourite guests out of literally hundreds of interviews over the years. So today, Ana Matronic from Scissor Sisters, she digs those droids.
I just sort of always assumed that everybody loves robots. Doesn't everybody love them? Aren't they just the coolest thing ever?
But she's not the only famous musician to grace the earbuds of our podcast listeners over the years. We have surely Imperial's most famous PhD student.
I think I'm just Brian May, the curious mind, really. I really have a passion for unusual things, and this was unfinished business in the back of my mind for 30 years, I suppose. And it brings you close to the cosmos, I guess.
Yep, that was Brian May in 2007, having just completed his Imperial PhD thesis after taking some time away from his research to do some stuff. Apparently, he joined some band or something. So, taking several decades to hand in your thesis, it's hardly the end of the universe, is it? So, what is?
There's no theory of the cosmos that stretches our universe into the far future more or less unchanged. Like, something's going to happen that will change the structure of our universe in a way that will be presumably disastrous for anything living in it.
The Imperial College Podcast.
All right, well, let's get going on this little archive special that we have for you this month. In 2015, the singer Ana Matronic of Scissor Sisters fame was at Imperial. She'd been hanging out with robots, she loves robots, at Aldo Faisal's lab as part of a radio documentary she was making. Ana Matronic was right at home, and so was starstruck reporter Colin Smith, a huge Scissor Sisters fan who heard just how far Ana Matronic's love of droids has taken her.
In addition to being a performer, am a robophile. I'm a lifelong lover of robots, so I've written a book about them called Robot Takeover, 100 Iconic Robots of Myth, Popular Culture, and Real Life. A lovingly comprehensive look at the way we use robots in fiction, all the different ways we use robots, and also how we've realized robots in real life. So not just fiction, but also real life. 65 fictional robots, 35 real ones.
Where has this fascination with robots come from?
I don't know. I just sort of always assumed that everybody loves robots. Doesn't everybody love them? Aren't they just the coolest thing ever? And so I chalk it up to pop culture. I was not yet 3 when the first Star Wars came out. And being a child of the 70s in America, there was all this pop culture. Buck Rogers, Battlestar Galactica, The Bionic Woman and $6 Million Man, that showed robots or people interacting with robots in some way. And so I think in that way it was sort of an intrinsic love based on my early childhood. And then I became interested in the 1990s in transhumanism, and that was through the love of the TV show The Bionic Woman, and then also the writings of the theorist Donna Haraway, who wrote the Cyborg Manifesto.
I'm absolutely fascinated at the moment by transhumanism. Could you tell listeners a little bit more about that?
Well, transhumanism is the study of robotics and technology and the ethics surrounding all that and how it can be applied to human biology. So everything from nanorobotics to life-extending capabilities, to combating death itself, creating avatars or mind files for people so that if something happens to you, your loved ones could interact with a computerized version of you.
What's your favorite robot?
If I have to choose one, I say the Bionic Woman, but then she's not technically a robot, she's a cyborg. But I love R2-D2 and C-3PO. I love Maria from Metropolis. I love Grandmother from the Ray Bradbury story, I Sing the Body Electric. Yeah, I loved the machines in Terminator, particularly Terminator Salvation. I thought those were really cool. Baymax from Big Hero 6 was so cute and funny. Data from Star Trek, love him.
Lastly, you came to Imperial to visit Dr Aldo Faisal in his robotics lab. How did you find it?
The technology that he is working on is fascinating, and I think something that will just enhance our lives. It will revolutionize the lives of people who are disabled and don't have full motor function. It, to me, is just so fascinating and such an exciting time to be alive.
Ana Matronic speaking there to Colin Smith. So let's go back to 2007 when this podcast was just a few months old and we managed to bag a pretty big interview. Not a bad start, really. But first up, an Imperial College PhD student has just submitted his thesis, and one of his extramural activities alongside being a student here at Imperial is playing in a rock band. And you might think, well, that could apply to many students, but not all of them are Brian May from Queen. But it is true, Brian, you have just handed in your thesis. It is here, it's a weighty looking tome in front of us. Just give us the title of this PhD.
The title is A Survey of Radial Velocities in the Zodiacal Dust Cloud. It's an investigation into the movements of dust particles in the solar system. We're actually surrounded by dust everywhere, not just like house dust or whatever. Dust which is the result of various things, probably collisions of asteroids, the remains of comets, and even interstellar dust. But as you probably know, we really are made of dust. Everything that we see around us has been inside a star. Dust and gas are the components of everything. It's the study of dust which is quite close to us in the solar system, between us and the sun, and a bit further out as well, out towards about as far as Jupiter. And what we were doing was looking with a spectrometer, looking for Doppler shifts in the light which is reflected from this dust.
So what kind of insights do you get into the dust by sort of studying it then?
Well, the questions that you want to ask are where did it come from, what's it doing, and what does it have to do with the creation of the Earth and the other planets. So in studying its motions, we have a unique way of getting some insights into where it came from. That's the big question, I suppose. You know, what's it doing there? What does it have to do with us?
And I noticed that in the title of your thesis is the word motion. So you're not just interested in the dust as a static entity, you're actually interested in the way it moves as well then?
That's right. Most of the studies of the zodiacal dust cloud that have been done have been photometric, in other words, just measuring how much there is there, and what's the brightness, what's the distribution. And it's an unusual technique to actually measure the velocities. Actually, astronomy is full of Doppler shift investigations, but it's quite unusual to apply it to this dust cloud. It's unusual because it's very difficult to do, in fact. It's hellish difficult to do, in fact.
Is this partly why it took so long to do it then?
Well, yeah, maybe, yeah. I mean, I had to build the instrument. I had to build a thing called a Fabry-Perot spectrometer, which is a much more luminous instrument than most of your spectrometers, which are slits, done with a slit and a grating. So it's a very specialised instrument which gives you the best chance of gathering enough photons to get some clue as to what's going on. The instrument that I built in 1970 is very crude by today's standards, so I'm hoping to go back and repeat the observations with a much better system. Nevertheless, we got good enough spectra to make some conclusions, and the conclusions we drew were roughly that certainly some of the dust is in prograde orbits, in other words going around the sun in the same way as the Earth is. Some of it probably isn't, some of it may be drifting through the solar system, and we were able to make some estimates of the size of the particles. So it's in a sense it's early days with this kind of investigation, but certainly it looks like if we got more accurate measurements we would be able to answer some more questions.
Right, so it's a kind of proof of principle then that this is a viable technique for studying this kind of dust?
Yes. Fortunately, we published my results in two journals. We published an article in Nature and an article in Monthly Notices of the Royal Astronomical Society. So the stuff is documented, which actually makes it a lot easier for me to defend my thesis, because what I can say is, look, the observations are there and they've been quoted by other people, and they were actually the first complete survey around the ecliptic of these measurements.
And the backstory being that this is work that you started off as a student here at Imperial College in the 1970s, and then you hung out with the rock band, and the rest, as they say, is history. So was it that you did the observations back in the 1970s, and the bit you've been finishing off, writing up this thesis, is actually tabulating and analysing and communicating the results?
Yes, more or less, although in fact I did most of the analysis in those days as well. I've reinterpreted some of it in the light of what we know now.
And the obvious question, I know everyone's asking you this, but so why now? Why come back and finish this PhD? Because I assume that you're not, well, maybe you are, but are you setting out now to be a career scientist, or are you still Brian May, the musician, but this was unfinished business for you scientifically?
I think I'm just Brian May, the curious mind. Really, I really have a passion for unusual things, and this was unfinished business in the back of my mind for 30 years, I suppose. And I'm thrilled to be able to have the opportunity to go back and tie things up so I can hold this tome in my hand. But it's more than that, because this opens some doors, and we've already discussed the fact that I'll stay on and hopefully do some more observations. And it's the observations which I love. It takes you to the most beautiful places in the world, and it brings you close to the cosmos, I guess.
And what are the parallels between doing this as a scientist and your work as a musician? I mean, as you go about finishing a thesis like this, was it a little bit like finishing off an album where, you know, there's some point where you've just got to let the album go and do that last overdub and then send it off and get it cut? Was it a bit like that with this thesis, just knowing when to finish it?
Very much so, yeah, you hit it on the head, yeah. There were I had to really chuck everything out the window. I mean, I had to stop doing almost everything to finish the thesis at some point. Having made that commitment, I really had to go for it. And there were some difficult times. But yes, very much like an album, very much like a piece of music, because you want it to be perfect and you want it to be everything that you dreamed it could be, but at some point you have to stop.
I'd imagine you have a reputation for being somebody who, you know, you must be a perfectionist, and the rest of the people are saying, come on, the album's done, Brian, just leave it, move on. You know, is that what you like as a musician and partly what you like as a scientist?
That's probably a fair comment, yeah. I'm usually the guy who's in there till 5 a.m. tweaking things, yeah. There's a kind of push-pull thing that goes on, because you have to have perspective, you have to have an overview, so you have to step back quite often. But there are times when you have to step right in and look at the detail and the little nuances which make all the difference. So you have to sort of have an incredibly adjustable zoom lens, I think, to make the best of anything, really, art or science. That's my feeling.
What's it like to be back here after what must be quite an interesting career break for you?
It's very curious. I feel a bit like that book by H.G. Wells called The Sleeper Wakes. I don't know if you ever read it. It's not a very well-known book. But the guy sort of goes to sleep for some reason, wakes up 100 years later and has to deal with all the changes. It's a bit like that for me, because it looks pretty similar, a lot of it. And I walk around and I see a lot of the same landmarks, and I walk into the same physics building and the same lecture theatre is still there.
It's hardly changed a bit, is it?
No, but there are subtle differences. There are pictures on the wall. There are all these clues that an awful lot has happened since I've been here. There's pictures of the heads of departments and a lot more pictures around the place. It's also a lot more student friendly. There's a lot more of a campus than there used to be. It used to be a bit of a cold place, Imperial College. You tended to go out for your entertainment, but now there's a real feeling of community here. So it's odd, it's very odd. And of course I'm a bit of an oddity here, you know, I can't really blend into the background. People look at me in a very strange way a lot of the time.
And any invitations from the Rock Music Society then to join in?
I've had various invitations, but again I've resisted everything up to now, because I didn't want to get too embroiled in enjoyable life, because I wanted to do the job. And I thought it would get in the way if I was too visible.
So what's your biggest achievement then, Brian? Is it this thesis in front of us or Bohemian Rhapsody? There's a question.
Well, it's hard to compare. I mean, Bohemian Rhapsody really is a triumph for Freddie. Yes, we all contributed. Yeah, I'm very proud of what I contributed to it, but that has to go down as a Freddie masterpiece, really. I don't know. I have a strange feeling that in 100 years' time people will probably care about the music more than the Zodiacal Lust, but Zodiacal Lust, the Freudian slip, the Zodiacal Lust. But for me, they're both important. I love the fact that I can reach into both areas and enjoy them. I'm actually very excited by music and by astronomy, and for the first time in my life, I'm able to actually contribute to both. I'm in a very fortunate position.
Dr. Brian May speaking to the podcast back in 2007. And finally, the end. I mean, literally the end. You'll know what I mean as you sit back and listen to this previously unreleased interview from about 3 years ago.
So I'm here with Katie Mack, who is on Twitter at AstroKatie, and she's been speaking at our Science for Fiction event that was organised by one of our professors here to give some science fiction writers some tips on what the science says. So you gave a talk about 4 ways that the universe could die. Which is your favourite?
Well, the talk was 4 ways. There are other possibilities, but my favorite was one of the 4, which is vacuum decay. And that's a process where basically the universe is destroyed by a bubble of quantum death that expands out at the speed of light from some random point at a random time in the universe. probably won't happen anytime soon. It's very, very unlikely, but there's been some fascinating research in particle physics talking about the possibility that our vacuum is not fully stable and that some kind of process of decay of our universe could happen at some point in the future.
Now, you told us not to worry about this, in part because it's very unlikely, but also because as it travels at the speed of light, we wouldn't really see it coming. Yeah. But when you consider these deaths of the universe, do you ever get a bit kind of melancholy about it?
It's funny, yeah, sometimes. It gives you an interesting perspective to think about, the universe had a beginning, and as far as we know, based on our understanding, for all practical purposes, it will have an end. There's no theory of the cosmos that stretches our universe into the far future more or less unchanged. Like, something's going to happen that will change the structure of our universe in a way that will be presumably disastrous for anything living in it. That's kind of a sobering thought sometimes, but it also kind of puts into perspective, little daily troubles. Well, someday the universe is going to end, so maybe it's not that bad. And it's also really interesting because it's so far in the future, these different scenarios, that it doesn't have any impact on your own life, but it's a sort of sobering thought just thinking of these massive forces and how the cosmos changes on the largest scale on these unimaginable timelines. It can really change your perspective on the here and now of, we're sitting on this very pleasant planet, surviving in this universe that in some ways is very, very hostile as you get farther out in time and farther out in space. And so it kind of makes you appreciate what we have here and want to preserve it.
Now, I know you're also writing a book on this subject, and you've been doing a bit of a tour in the UK, also doing some research. So what's the most surprising thing you've learnt so far?
I've been talking to a lot of people about how we're studying the end of the universe and how we're going to learn more about the future of the universe with new telescopes and new data and new theory and all of that. I think that the two surprising things are, one is that there's no real agreement on how we're going to figure this out or what we're actually going to know in the future. Some people are very optimistic and some people are very pessimistic about our understanding improving a lot in the next couple of decades. But the other thing that I found really interesting is whenever I interview a cosmologist or a particle theorist or whoever, I ask, how do you feel about the end of the universe? How do you feel about the idea that the universe will come to an end? And I get a very wide variety of responses. Some people say that it's very sad, or that it sounds really boring for, this idea of the heat death where the universe will just keep expanding and expanding and expanding and eventually we'll be in this cold, dark, empty space. That's the most likely end of the universe. That sounds very boring to some people and they don't like it for that reason. And, some people say, I think it's great. I think, we should be transient creatures and just enjoy what we have while we have it, in this very philosophical look at it. And some people say that thinking about the end of the universe just makes them want to try and fix climate change. And just, you can't think about the end of the universe, but we can think about the problems we have here. And every time, you start to feel sad about the end of the universe, it can kind of bring you back to like, well, we have something now we can work on and try and make our own lives better right now. And so it's been very interesting to see that diversity of responses of all people who are physicists working in this field, thinking about these questions all the time, how we all deal with it differently. It's been really interesting.
Science fiction, I think, deals a lot with this kind of philosophy of science and how that makes us reflect on our lives. You consume a lot of science fiction.
Yes. I read a lot of science fiction. I watch a lot of science fiction. At some point in the last few years, I was thinking about the kind of fiction I read and TV shows I watch and stuff like that. And I decided that I was going to focus on things that involve spaceships because I needed to make sure that I had some good escapism in my life and some, something that maybe had a little bit of a science component but wasn't anything to do with reality. And so I'm just going to read books about spaceships and watch TV shows about spaceships. And that turns out to be a really nice goal if you really want to make sure that you're getting as escapist as humanly possible in your leisure time.
So it's escapism, but do you ever sort of notice the errors? Do you have any bugbears like faster than light travel or anything?
I don't mind that stuff too much. I think it's okay in fiction to, take flights of fancy and to to imagine, like, what if we could do this? You know, how would that change society? I mean, because that's often the question, right? Like, it's not really about the science, it's about how people respond to these very different situations in terms of technology or in terms of where they are or how they can travel between places. And so the interesting point is always, how do people react? How does society change? And so I think it's okay to tweak a knob on, you know, some bit of the physics and just see what happens. And maybe you get some insight into human nature by looking at those outlandish ideas. But it is also nice occasionally to find fiction where the science is really, really right, and maybe there's some tweak somewhere, but it makes sense, and everything else is consistent. Like those kinds of things are very satisfying. But I don't hold it against authors when they need to take a shortcut to get to a story. I think that's okay.
Katie Mack, aka Astro Katie, talking there to Hayley Dunning. Well, assuming the universe is still here, I certainly hope so. I've booked some tickets to a gig. Then we'll be back next month. Thanks very much for listening, whether it's just to this episode or maybe a few of our podcasts, or indeed everything we have put out over the last 16 years. Wow. I'm Gareth Mitchell, bidding you a fond farewell for now. Bye-bye.